As part of the housewarming party event for Payday 2, the game is receiving a buttload of new content. 2 new difficulties have just been introduced as part of this, to add to the 4 already present. To quickly give context, Overkill, the formerly second hardest difficulty, was the most commonly played difficulty, and Death Wish, the hardest, was second to that. Both had their own niche audiences within the Payday community, as some preferred the punishing difficulty of Death Wish, while some wanted just a fun time in Overkill. 2 new difficulties have been added, one between Overkill and Death Wish called Mayhem, and a new hardest difficulty called One Down. Both have the same general issue, but I'll be looking more closely at Mayhem as the example, as I have more experience with Overkill than with the hardest difficulties. Fans were glad to see the arrival of a new difficulty to bridge the large gap between Overkill and Death Wish. However, it hasn't really done that. In fact, it's more akin to Death Wish and Overkill in its current state, and that has some people riled up. These complaints mark a problem relevant to Payday 2 since its launch, and it's that the community has collectively experienced immense power creep over the years. It's a bizarre issue. How can an entire player base experience what's normally a feature built into a game before launch? Well, it's not so complicated when you break it down. Payday 2 at launch was a very different beast to the game today. The weapons were sufficient to dispose of cop waves, but only at the lowest difficulties. Players had to level up to unlock better weapons, and it took even longer for the randomized reward system to give people the weapon modifications that they desired. Perhaps most importantly, there was no meta. In fact, many of the weapons and items that are seen as essential today weren't even in the game back in 2013. Over the months, many updates, free and paid alike, have been released. Most notably were the Gauge weapon packs, which introduced grenades and later light machine guns as well as melee weapons. Additional levels up to 500 were also added to account for the highest level players who had already maxed out at 100. By the time players got used to the game's challenge, cloakers were added in a second Gauge weapon pack, a new special enemy unit. Despite being present in Payday the Heist, they confused players by how different they were to other enemies in the game. Basically, they charge towards the player and knock them down with a one-hit melee kick. They then throw down a smoke bomb, and any player who approaches their teammate to help is also knocked down. By the time this was sussed, a new difficulty was added, Death Wish. You see, up until then, the most challenging difficulty was Overkill, and the developers obviously intended for the game to be even more difficult, so they did it. The problem was, whilst the game became more difficult, the players became more powerful, and they did so at such a rate that the game could not keep up. As new, bigger, more difficult heists were added such as Shadow Raid, Big Bank and Hotline Miami, players gained access to snipers, shotguns and grenade launchers. So it continued until this year, 2016. In the meantime, 2 new enemies were added, the SWAT van turret and Captain Winters. However, they couldn't stack up against a selection of 5 skill trees compared to 4 from before, and a plethora of perk decks which granted players all sorts of new abilities. To add to this issue, the drive to make more DLC resulted in access to miniguns, flamethrowers, molotovs, bows, dynamites, crossbows, you get the idea. Stealth in the game used to be a great challenge, but when stealth players learned the best and most efficient ways to get in and out quietly, stealthing became a count by numbers. Overkill, what was once harder than even Death Wish today, became the standard easy relaxing challenge of the game, and dedicated Death Wish players found no issue with the worst the game had to offer. The Bulldozer, what was once every player's greatest fear, could be taken down while staring them down face to face. So, here we are. The influence of new weapons, explosives and flame-based weaponry has taken its toll, and now we are well-equipped heisters ready to take on the world. The weapon and skill rebalances have taken the Car 4 and the Pistol Messiah skill from our metagame. We have adapted, and as such, the game continues to pose little threat to us. It only makes sense that change would come. Interestingly, the developers Overkill Software opted not to make the currently existing difficulties more intense as they usually do, but instead introduced 2 new difficulties to give us an option of what we want to play. And this is where the problems come in, especially in regards to Mayhem. It's too hard. Well, that's what the general consensus is. If you're revived, you keep only 10% of your health, much like in Death Wish. Enemies take many more hits to defeat compared to the one-hit headshots of Overkill difficulty, and the changes made to bulldozers across all difficulties have been decimating players on any difficulty higher than Overkill. Most people refer to the enemies as bullet sponges, taking far too many shots for what's expected. I'm sure for any Death Wish player they wouldn't be a problem at all, but the same is being experienced further up the difficulty ladder with one down. We've become so used to the easier nature of the game that any changes that up the difficulty feel unfitting and even wrong. So, should they change these new difficulties to become more in line with what players expect? Well, it's difficult.